My name is Thomas, an aspiring filmmaker, always on the lookout for remote locations to capture unique landscapes. In April 2022, I chose the Black Ridge Mountains in Colorado as the perfect setting for a solo project. Absolute isolation, little explored trails, and a sky that promised to be a burst of stars. With my camera, tripod, lightweight tent, and supplies, I was confident it would be a transformative experience. The first day was calm, the weather was mild, and the silence of the forest was almost comforting. I spent hours filming the steep cliffs and winding paths, fascinated by the vastness around me. But in the middle of the afternoon, I noticed another hiker on the trail. He was ahead, walking steadily with firm, constant steps, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. I waved at him, but got no response. I called out a, "Hey," but he kept walking, never looking back. Something about his stiff posture and almost mechanical movements made my stomach churn. He's probably just focused, maybe listening to music, I thought, trying to shake off the unease. When the sun began to dip below the horizon, I found a small clearing to set up camp. The view was incredible, and I took the opportunity to set up my camera for a time-lapse of the starry sky. The campfire crackled softly as I prepared my meal. But then, something changed. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a silhouette standing perfectly still, about 100 meters from my tent. The same man. I swallowed hard and shouted, "Do you need something?" No response. He was just standing there, perfectly still, like a shadow against the trees. I decided to ignore him. Maybe he just wanted to keep his distance. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The silence of the forest felt heavier, as if something was watching me. When I finally fell asleep, I was jolted awake by the sound of cracking branches. My heart raced. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent carefully, and shone the light into the darkness. Nothing, just trees and shadows. It must be an animal, I muttered to myself, though my voice sounded weak, almost without conviction. I lay back down, but soon I heard footsteps. This time, they were slow and deliberate, circling my camp. Panic took over. I gripped the flashlight like a weapon and shouted, "Who's there? Show yourself." The response came as a sound that froze my blood. A low, guttural laugh, as if it was vibrating through the trees around me. I rushed out of the tent, shining the flashlight through the forest. The light caught something moving between the trees, too fast for me to identify. Then, an even more terrifying sound echoed, a deep, primal growl, like something that wasn't human. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt glued to the ground. Fear paralyzed me. In the darkness, the trees seemed alive, their branches twisting like outstretched arms. Somehow, I survived that night. When the first ray of sunlight appeared, I stumbled out of the tent, shaking, exhausted, but relieved to be alive. It was then that I noticed the footprints. Large, bare, and scattered all over my campsite, as if someone, or something, had been watching me all night long. Near a tree, I saw my food bag torn apart. Whatever it was, it had enough strength to rip it to pieces. I also found marks in the dirt, like claws scratching the ground. I decided I wasn't going to stick around to find out what might happen the next night. With trembling hands, I packed everything up and began the trail back to my car. On the way back, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Every crack of a branch or gust of wind made me turn my head, expecting to see something lurking between the trees. Finally, I spotted my car. A wave of relief washed over me. I threw everything into the trunk with trembling hands, not caring about organizing anything, and jumped into the vehicle, quickly turning the key. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the road as fast as it allowed. That's when I heard a sharp sound. The car began to pull to the side, and my heart raced when I realized the tire had blown. I stepped out to check, fighting the sensation that something was watching me in the dimness of the road. The tire was completely destroyed, as if something had passed through it, but there were no rocks or sharp objects visible on the path. As I changed the tire, I felt that presence again. The trees seemed to lean over me, as if hiding invisible eyes watching me. I rushed, but my hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped the lug wrench. When I finally finished, I got back in the car and continued driving, forcing myself not to look in the rearview mirror. About 10 minutes later, something even worse happened. As I passed a particularly muddy stretch of the road, the car started to skid. I tried to accelerate to get out of it, but the wheels spun uselessly. Stuck in the middle of that desolate road, surrounded by shadows that seemed to grow more alive with each passing second, I was beginning to panic, imagining what might happen if I stayed there too long, when, by some luck, I saw headlights in the distance. 2 men in a truck stopped to help. One of them, an older man with a weathered face and a worn felt hat, got out of the vehicle with a suspicious smile. "Need some help, son?" he asked, while the other man prepared to pull my car with a chain. I explained what had happened and mentioned that I was coming back from the Black Ridge Mountains. As soon as I mentioned the name of the place, the man's smile vanished, and he gave me a concerned look. "You are crazy for camping out there alone?" he asked, his voice low, almost as if he were afraid of being overheard. "That place is haunted. Everyone around here knows that." "Haunted? What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual, though my stomach was in knots. "Old stories. They say Tyr is something in that forest. I don't know if it's true, but strange things happen out there. People disappear, sounds that shouldn't exist. My grandfather used to say the spirits of the mountain don't like to be disturbed." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. The man seemed to notice my discomfort and gave me a pat on the shoulder. "You are lucky you made it out alive, son. Not everyone does." They helped me get my car out of the mud, and within 15 minutes, I was back on the road, thanking them more than words could express. I drove the rest of the way in silence, replaying the events of the previous night, and now these stories about the mountains. Even today, I still try to understand what happened that night. Maybe it was just another hiker, someone peculiar, or maybe it was something I don't even want to imagine. Since then, I've never camped alone again. The forest is beautiful, but it also holds secrets that are probably better left undiscovered. My name is Rachel, and until that night, camping was something I never thought about doing. My life as a social worker was full of chaos. My refuge was in hot baths, audiobooks, and cheap wine. But my best friend, Clara, had other ideas. "A weekend in the forests of Red Hollow will renew your soul," she said, with an enthusiasm I couldn't refuse. Reluctantly, I agreed. The drive to the campsite was breathtaking. Golden fields gave way to densely wooded hills tinged with deep green from the spring. Clara was excited, singing along to her favorite playlist. When we finally found a secluded spot to set up the tent, I admit I began to understand the appeal. A stream meandered nearby, the fresh scent of pine hung in the air, and the stillness seemed to embrace the world. As the sun disappeared, the sky exploded in shades of orange and purple, as if the forest was bidding the light farewell with one last vibrant breath. Despite its beauty, this was making me anxious and nervous. The campfire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows against the trees that seemed to grow taller and taller, like silent sentinels watching us. In my mind, I heard terrifying sounds that scared me. Clara was excited, telling stories from work, her past trail adventures, and the places she still wanted to explore. I tried to get involved, but there was something in the silence of the surrounding forest that left me restless. It was as if the world had stopped, as if we were trapped in a still frame, where even the wind seemed hesitant to blow. Despite the discomfort I couldn't explain, Clara's laughter eventually got to me. We laughed at silly stories, shared old confessions, and talked about our plans for the future. For a brief moment, I felt at peace, or almost. Deep down, a part of me was aware of that uneasy feeling. Like in a horror movie, when you know something is about to happen, as if something or someone was lurking, just waiting. When the fire began to die down, I noticed how the darkness around us seemed alive. The shadows that had once danced in harmony now seemed to move erratically, almost aggressively. The crackling of the last embers seemed louder than it should have, as if the sound was being swallowed by the forest. Clara sighed, content, as she started to curl up in her sleeping bag. "Listen to that," she said, closing her eyes. "The stream. So relaxing, don't you think?" I listened, but the sound of the stream no longer felt comforting. It was as if something else was mixed with it, a distant murmur, almost imperceptible but persistent. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. Clara was already closing her eyes, but I lay still, staring at the ceiling of the tent while the silence of the night became oppressive. When exhaustion finally started to take over, I heard something. It wasn't the stream. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something that seemed to be hidden among the trees, waiting for the darkness to grow. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. Something was wrong. The familiar sound of the stream was there, but there was something else, a faint, distant sound, like laughter. It wasn't natural. It sounded high-pitched, childlike, but wrong. "Clara, did you hear that?" I whispered, my heart pounding against my ribs. She shifted beside me. "Hear what?" "Laughter, like children." She lifted her head and listened. The sound came again, clearer this time, carried by the wind. Clara frowned. It must be another campsite, kids playing, go back to sleep. I wanted to believe her, but there was something in her tone, a hesitation that made me feel like she wasn't convinced either. I tried to sleep, but the discomfort wouldn't fade. When the sound returned, it wasn't distant anymore. It was close, very close. The laughter was now accompanied by whispers, like muffled voices, talking, conspiring. Clara was already sitting up, the lantern in her hands. "This isn't normal," she murmured, turning on the light and illuminating the darkness. The beam of light danced across the trees, casting shadows on twisted branches. "Hello? Who's there?" Clara called, her voice echoing. Silence. The laughter stopped abruptly. We sat there, frozen, listening. Then it started again, but now it was right next to the tent. Clara quickly unzipped it, shining the light outside. There was no one there, just still trees and the pale glow of the moon. "Someone's playing a prank," she said, trying to sound confident, but the tremble in her voice gave it away. "Clara, get back inside." I pulled her back in. "We don't know who or what's out there." The rest of the night was a nightmare. The laughter and whispers came and went, accompanied by slow footsteps and leaves being crushed. Something was walking in circles around the tent. With every snap of a branch, Clara gripped the knife she had brought. When the first light of morning filtered through the trees, the sound finally stopped. Exhausted and terrified, we stepped out of the tent. What we saw froze the blood in my veins. In the center of the campsite, a strange pattern had been made with branches, leaves, and stones, an intricate spiral tightly wound in the center. It wasn't random. It was too precise, too intentional. Clara covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide. "Did you do this?" "Of course not." My voice came out in a hoarse whisper. As we hurriedly packed up, Clara suddenly stopped, pointing at the forest. High up in a tree, something was swaying. I approached reluctantly, my heart racing with every step. It was a doll, raw, made of old rags, straw, and rope. Two black dots painted as eyes and a crooked, almost mocking, smile drawn on the cloth face. "We're leaving, now," Clara screamed, grabbing my arm. We threw our things in the car and sped off. As we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I swear I saw a tall, thin figure between the trees. When I blinked, it was gone. The drive back to the city was in complete silence, Clara gripping the wheel tightly. When we finally parked in front of my apartment, she broke the silence. "I am never camping again. Never." I agreed. I can't explain what happened that night. Maybe it was an elaborate prank, but something inside me knows it wasn't. The forest felt alive, filled with invisible eyes and dark intentions. Even today, the sound of those laughs haunts me. I close my eyes and hear them, sharp, dancing in the darkness. Red Hollow wasn't a place for us, and it isn't a place for anyone. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me and my girlfriend Camila, away from the chaos of the city. After months of insane schedulisher with hospital shifts and me drowning in office reports, decided to escape to the serenity of Pine Hollow, a remote forest she vaguely remembered visiting as a child. Camila described the place as magical, a hidden clearing, a crystal-clear stream, and the serenity of pines that reached for the sky. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, and the landscape looked like it had been pulled from a painting. The air was fresh, filled with a sense of earth and wildflowers. The only sound was the gentle murmur of the stream, mingling with the rustling of the trees. As we set up the tent by the riverbank, a sense of isolation began to unsettle me. There were no other campers around. No laughter, no remnants of extinguished bonfires, just the two of us. In that moment, I thought it was perfect. But the forest was too quiet. That night, sitting around the campfire, we laughed and shared stories as the stars twinkled above us. Then came the first crack, a branch breaking in the distance. My body froze, and I asked, "Did you hear that?" Camila lifted her face from her teacup, carefree. "Probably an animal. We're in their territory, remember?" I forced a smile, but something felt off. It was just a branch, right? We dozed off in the tent, but sleep eluded me. The sound of the stream, which had been relaxing before, now seemed to hide something. When I finally drifted off, I woke suddenly. Outside, footsteps, quiet but deliberate, circling our tent. I whispered, "Camila, do you hear that?" She opened her eyes, visibly nervous. Before she could answer, the sound stopped. I slowly got up, grabbing the lantern. I unzipped the tent, my heart pounding, and illuminated the darkness outside. Nothing. Just motionless trees, as if they were watching us. I went back inside, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, but my instincts screamed otherwise. The next morning, when I stepped out of the tent, my blood ran cold. Footprints. They weren't ours. Someone had been there. Camila turned pale as she noticed the marks leading to the stream and then disappearing. "This isn't normal," she whispered, her eyes full of fear. We decided to explore nearby. We moved cautiously away from the campsite. That's when, between the trees, I spotted something. An improvised shelter made of branches and pieces of old tarpaulin. Inside, candy wrappers, an empty bottle, and, worst of all, a pair of binoculars. They were pointed directly at our camp. "They were watching us," Camila whispered, her voice thick with horror. My heart was hammering in my chest. Whoever they were, they knew we were there, and clearly, they were lurking. We ran back to the tent. We decided to leave at dawn, but by that point, the night felt endless. When the sun set, the forest seemed to take on a new form. The air became heavy, suffocating, as if something invisible was watching us, waiting. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it seemed alive, pulsating between the trees. Sitting in the tent, the lantern burning was our only protection from the abyss that surrounded us. The sounds started subtly, a distant crack, followed by another, closer. Soon, the sound of breaking branches echoed all around, each noise stealing the breath from our lungs. It was methodical, as if something or someone was circling us, toying with our sanity. Suddenly, a dragged sound came from the darkness. It sounded like something heavy being pulled across the earth, slowly approaching, as if it had all the time in the world. Camila squeezed my hand, her eyes wide, fixed on the entrance of the tent. Each second felt like an eternity. Her breath was shallow and irregular, and I could feel her body trembling. Then we saw it, the shadow. It moved around the tent slowly, like a predator savoring its prey's fear. It was tall, distorted, and seemed to absorb the little light that escaped from the lantern. My heart pounded so loudly I feared it could be heard outside. Camila, with a trembling voice, whispered, "It's not alone." With each movement of the shadow, the tent seemed to shrink, becoming a claustrophobic space. When the shadow stopped at the entrance, the silence was absolute. No sound of branches, wind, or animals, just the frantic beating of our hearts. A sudden noise broke the silence, a scratching on the tent's fabric. Something slid outside, circling slowly. The sound of nails or claws dragging across the material seemed to mock us, as if it knew we had nowhere to run. I forced myself to hold the lantern steady, even though my hands were shaking as if I was about to lose control. The thing dragged something heavy across the tent, the sound so close we could almost feel the vibrations. A dull thud echoed, and then, as if satisfied, the shadow disappeared. We stayed there, motionless, not daring to move until the first light of morning finally pierced the fabric. When dawn broke, the clearing looked exactly as it had the day before, until we looked around. Footprints, many, deep, scattered haphazardly, as if a crowd had surrounded us during the night. But what froze me to the bone was their precision. The marks didn't belong to boots or common bare feet. They were different, elongated, with fingers longer than they should be. As we hurriedly packed up the tent, our hands clumsy from trembling, a sound came from the edge of the forest. A hollow thud, like wood swinging in the wind. We looked toward the sound and saw something that made my vision darken for a moment, in pure terror. A branch, bent as if holding a macabre trophy, swung something grotesque. A doll. It wasn't made of plastic or cloth, but a tangle of torn fabrics and straw, held together by makeshift ropes. The face was what marked me. Uneven black eyes, painted like bottomless pits, and a distorted, almost sarcastic smile that seemed to mock us. The ropes binding the doll were so tight, they seemed to sink into the fabric, like a cruel offering. Camila took a step back, nearly tripping. This wasn't here yesterday. Her voice was a thread, breaking at the end. The air around us seemed to vibrate, as if the forest had held its breath. I grabbed Camila's hand, and we ran to the car, not looking back. When the car door slammed shut, the sound of the forest was left behind, but the feeling of being watched never left us. As we drove down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Between the tall trunks, I swear I saw something watching us. Tall, motionless, with a silhouette blending into the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. But deep down, I knew it was still there, waiting. I'll never go back to that place. Pine Hollow isn't just a forest. It's something that breathes, that thinks, that watches. And we were foolish enough to enter its territory. It was supposed to be an adventure among friends, a weekend to disconnect from our routine and reconnect with nature. I, Matthias, and my two best friends, Rodrigo and Lucas, had been planning the trip for weeks. We chose the Serra Escura Trail, a remote, mountainous area known for its breathtaking landscapes, but seldom visited by tourists. I personally was excited. I had just started my travel vlog, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity to record something incredible. We arrived at the trailhead on a sunny morning. The weather was perfect, and the mountains in the background seemed inviting, even with their mysterious aura. Our backpacks were heavy with new gear and supplies for 2 days. The trail was peaceful, and even the sound of birds and the wind through the trees seemed to welcome us. After a few hours of hiking, we found the perfect camping spot near a stream. We set up our tents in a circle, and as night fell, we gathered around the campfire. The warmth of the fire contrasted with the growing cold of the mountain. Rodrigo was the optimist of the group, always laughing and telling funny stories. Lucas, on the other hand, seemed restless. He looked around, as if he expected to see something moving between the trees. "Are you okay, man?" I asked, noticing his distant stare. "I don't know. I just think it's too quiet here," he replied. I laughed to lighten the mood, but deep down, I felt the same way. It was as if the forest was watching us. Around 10 p.m., we heard footsteps coming from the trail. We all looked up at once, alert. A group of 3 people was approaching. They looked worn out, dirty clothes, heavy backpacks, and empty stares. One of them, a man with a scruffy beard, raised his hand in greeting. "Good evening," he said, his voice hoarse and deep. We exchanged greetings, but something about them felt off. The youngest of the group, a guy with a piercing gaze, started asking questions that made me uncomfortable. "Are you guys camping here? Alone? Did you bring good food?" Rodrigo, always friendly, responded politely, but Lucas and I exchanged worried glances. Why were they so interested in our supplies and the fact that we were alone? After a few minutes of strange conversation, the group said their goodbyes and continued down the trail. But before disappearing into the shadows, the older man turned and said, "Good luck tonight." That sentence kept echoing in my mind as we returned to the campfire. Lucas, now visibly tense, spoke. "They're strange. I didn't like them." I agreed, but Rodrigo tried to reassure us. "You guys are paranoid. Maybe they're just misunderstood." Still, that night felt different. Fatigue didn't overcome the fear. Around midnight, when the fire had already died down, I heard a sound. First, light footsteps, then a slow, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the ground. My body froze. From inside the tent, I heard Rodrigo whisper, "Are you guys hearing this?" We stepped out of the tents with our flashlights in hand, trying to find the source of the noise. The light cut through the shadows, but revealed nothing except still trees and the stream in the distance. That's when I noticed Lucas's tent zipper was partially open. "Did you leave it like this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Number," he answered, out of breath. Suddenly, we heard a loud crack from the nearby trees. We turned our flashlights at the same time, and for a brief moment, I saw something move. It wasn't an animal, it was human. "Who's there?" I yelled, trying to sound firm, but my voice trembled. No answer, just the sound of quick footsteps fading in the opposite direction. We rushed back to the center of the camp, the 3 of us together, too scared to separate. We spent the rest of the night awake, the sound of our own hearts drowning out any other noise. When the sun finally rose, we felt a momentary relief. But the clearing, illuminated by the morning light, revealed something that made us freeze. Near where we had seen the movement, we found footprints. Many. They were large, barefoot, and scattered, as if a crowd had surrounded us during the night. In the middle of the trail leading to the stream, an even more disturbing sight awaited us. We stopped suddenly, as if the air around us had become too heavy to breathe. There, hanging between two low branches and intertwined with dry twigs and makeshift ropes, was a grotesque structure. It was impossible not to notice the almost ritualistic care with which it had been made. At the center of the structure, a deformed doll swayed slightly, rocking with the breeze. The doll was made of strips of torn fabric, tied with tight knots that seemed so taut they could cut through the material with the slightest movement. Its head was disproportionate, a pile of filthy rags and straw. But the face, the face was what made my blood run cold. Roughly painted with charcoal or black paint, two crooked, uneven eyes stared at us, empty but somehow alive. The wide, curved smile at an impossible angle seemed to mock us, as if it knew something we didn't. Lucas took a step back, his eyes wide and his breath quickening. This wasn't here yesterday," he murmured, his voice almost losing strength. Rodrigo, always the optimist, now looked as pale as the fabric of the doll. He took a step forward, but quickly recoiled, clenching his fists. "We need to get out of here, now," he said. But his voice came out hesitant, almost a whisper, as if fearing that any sound would draw attention to us. I agreed, but as we turned to go back to the camp and grab our things, Lucas tripped. It all happened so fast. He stepped on something, lost his balance, and fell to the ground with a sharp thud. He let out a scream of pain and grabbed his right arm, which now hung at an odd angle. "My arm! My arm!" he yelled, his face twisted in pain. We ran to him, but before we could help him up, Lucas began to tremble. His eyes widened, fixed on something invisible, and he mumbled, "Didn't you hear?" Rodrigo and I exchanged confused glances. "Hear what?" I asked, my heart racing. Lucas gripped my arm tightly, his fingers digging into my skin. His expression was filled with pure terror. "Voices," they said. "They said we won't make it out alive." A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, but all I could hear was the distant sound of the stream and the wind rustling through the trees. But something deep inside me knew he wasn't lying. There was something there, something we couldn't see. As Rodrigo tried to help him stand, Lucas started to thrash as if something was holding him down. "It's here! It's here!" he screamed, trying to pull his arm free, as if something invisible had grabbed it. Suddenly, the atmosphere seemed to change. The wind stopped, and the sound of the stream vanished. It was as if the forest had held its breath. The silence was so deep it felt suffocating. Finally, we managed to get Lucas to his feet, despite his groans of pain. We started to run, but each step felt heavier, as if the ground was pulling us down. The silence was broken by a guttural, distant sound, something between a grunt and a muffled laugh, coming from the depths of the forest. We reached the camp in a state of pure panic, our hands trembling as we tried to gather our things. Lucas kept glancing around, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "We can't stay here," he murmured. His eyes glazed over, and his voice almost faded. "They're watching us. They won't let us leave." I looked at Rodrigo, who was just as terrified as I was. There was no more doubt. We had to leave, and fast. But deep down, I knew that whatever was there wouldn't let us go without leaving its mark on us. We hurriedly threw our gear into our backpacks, not caring about packing it properly. On the way back, the feeling of being followed never left us. Every shadow between the trees seemed to move, every sound amplified by the tense silence surrounding us.
When we finally reached the car, we all got in and locked the doors, as if that could protect us. As Rodrigo started the engine, I glanced at the rear-view mirror. For a moment, I saw a tall figure between the trees. I froze, staring at it until it vanished, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. Since that day, none of us has gone camping again. Serra Escura wasn't just a secluded place. It had eyes, and we were foolish enough to invade its domain.
If you enjoyed these horror stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share with your friends. Thank you so much for being here, and see you next time, where the fear never sleeps.